I'm Hartwig Fischer, Director of the British Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's Era of Reclamation talk. I invited Bonnie Greer to curate a project, and together we identified reclamation as a prevalent theme of our era. This is also an opportunity to listen and to learn as we move towards the great transformation of the British Museum.
We're all brought up to believe that race is, a thing. It's what we are. You talk about construction, and you talk about construction as, the French expression of provocation, which is something to shake you up, make you think. Do you still feel that way? Is that still your guiding feeling?
I still feel the same way. It's still a provocation. It's still an ongoing debate. And it's debate that is shaped by other instances, all the things that you hear about the cancel culture, all the things that you hear about who gets to define their own identities and other people's identity. And yes, race, as we know, is a social construct. But more importantly, it's also a space where we can reclaim certain things. I'll give you an example. We talk about people of African descent. Some people don't like to talk about black people because indeed the notion of blackness or black people was kind of imposed by the colonial forces, and then the color black became, as you know, kind of demonized. But actually 21st century, perhaps 20th century before that, reclaimed that notion in that word and define it. So when I say the Black history, for example, I know exactly what I mean by Black history. It's the sum of the racism, the negativity, but also the resilience, the fighting against those ideas of inferiority. When I say that, it's all encompassed in those things. When I say a black man, there's a whole history behind that idea.
This book, African Europeans, for me, is about construction. It's about construction. We have in the collection of the British Museum, your museum, is a bust of Septimius Severus, who, when you look at him, we would call him a black man. He was Emperor of Rome for a brief period of time. He died in what is now York. But did the Romans see him like that? Did they see him as what we would call a black man? Did it matter to them?
Well, the Roman Empire is quite a fascinating place for me to look at when you talk about race, when you want to understand the construction of race, because it was more to do with power, it was more to do with your place in the world. And Septimus was born in North Africa from a relatively well-off family, but not that much. And he was extremely ambitious. He was educated, and he knew exactly how to make alliances. So it's about survival, but not survival because he was in a dire position, but survival in an environment where who you knew and who you know made the whole lot of difference. So he constructed a network across the empire. So he went to the Iberian Peninsula. And so the outlook of the Roman Empire is completely different, because the Roman Empire, the project was to expand. So Severus was on the confines of empire. Yes, he was what would be considered today as a black man, but first and foremost, he was a Roman. He was part of the empire. So, and as such, he was part of a project, of a colonization project that went beyond the people's color, skin color. The Roman Empire went as far as Egypt, for example. So it was different. What fascinates me was precisely to show that difference. And in the book, the idea was step by step to take you through those changes and to see how the commodification of black bodies or people of African descent body becomes actually essential in defining European identity, because that identity was defined in contrast and put in a hierarchy that is based first and foremost on greed, and on wealth building industry.
You know, this book is not a history book of the kings and the queens. This is not Wakanda. This book is going to make you look at how things were built and how the building still goes on, how we are sort of forced in, sucked in, bought in, led into the building of things, and how, in a sense, we tell ourselves stories, either through, for instance, we were all talking about the fact that the biggest cinema genre in America right now is what they call black horror, you know, films like Get Out and stuff like that. And that's an interesting kind of storyline there. Why is that? Why is that storytelling becoming so big? And so this, even though this is a solid, straight up book of history, it also goes into that as well.
As somebody who is completely influenced by my grandmother, who is a fantastic storyteller, she taught me that reclaiming one's space in the world is also about telling one's story, and in a way that we deemed fit to ourselves. So what I mean by that is that the stories are not, the histories and the stories are not necessarily in academia. They're all around us, and they are transmitted by our family. They're part of a bigger, much bigger picture, which is the ways in which you empower yourself, and you teach yourself something about yourself, but also about your community and the rest of the world by telling that story.
Racism is a project not only of color, but of gender. And if we look at what's going on in the United States now, for instance, and a bit here, a lot of this is in defense of a notion of masculinity, a destruction of a notion of masculinity in relation to men of color, particularly black men. It's a destruction of a notion of femininity, or the feminine in relation. So racism, and you point out in your book, it becomes this project of not only color, but gender.
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote completely focusing on trying to find women's voices and black women's voices in this book, and I can't find them simply because archival materials are not that available, and yet I know otherwise none of the black men would be here today. So what I did is seeing me as that voice across time and place, and looking at how actually the question of gender, again, we go back to the gaze and to the silences, are playing out across centuries, and how from that construction we see how black female body is being reduced to this aspect of exoticizing sexual object, or the mammy rather, the ridicule woman, or the angry women. So these are comforting stereotypes, and they really are comforting, because then people can just put these women into boxes and carry on ignoring the rest of the wealth that these women are actually producing. So the silences here are used as oppression to suppress something else. And I find it fascinating to look into the book without necessarily saying it that way, but showing across centuries how it plays out, and why we are here today talking about intersectional, whereas actually, well, it's always been intersectional, isn't it? For black women, we've always seen things like that.
How do you think, I mean, this museum, the British Museum, is changing. They're all changing. Whether they change they want to, or they don't. I mean, this museum wants to, but there's some museums that are being forced to. And how does a museum, with all of the stories, some good, some bad, some whatever, how do they play a part, or do they, in this sort of evil? I don't want to talk about the construction, because we know about the construction. Well, we can spend 2 days here talking about how a museum that came of age in empire constructed. I mean, and most of them did, including this one. But how do they now, can they, should they, play a part in this evolution of our coming to understand this story of construction of race?
Of course, I would say they should, but even if they don't want to, they're forced to, because even the resistance is always a response to what is happening outside these walls. But I would say that this is an interesting space for me, and for many of us, simply because I come from a French background where we talk a lot about power and how you challenge power. You can challenge it from the outskirts, the periphery, if you want to use technical words. And then from the periphery, it's really hard to eat that apple. Or you can be inside the apple and try and change the taste of that apple. And I believe that I want to be inside that apple, because I've seen those who are on the periphery, how it works for them. They're creative because then they can create a space that is not the apple, and these are also valid and incredibly important. But inside the apple, you can actually reshape the narrative of the past, and therefore reclaim again, retell the story, and reclaim that space, or claim that space, or create new space within that space, like palimpsest. And I love this idea. So I'm here as a guest, and I'm delighted, but I'm here at war.
How come we don't know our history?
We don't know because it's on purpose. Everybody thinks, oh no, you have a chip on your shoulder, the history all around. No, the construction of race, the construction of empire. In fact, I can spend whole days telling you about France, Auguste Renoir, nationhood. The creation of nationhood is based on the kind of textbooks that you use and who gets to be part of those textbooks.
Do museums erase history?
Do museums what?
Erase history?
They create their own narrative at the time, and those narratives, it's up to us to push for the narratives to change.
And of course, inside a museum, these narratives are coming your way. I mean, you cannot completely ignore them. And there are many narratives in this place.
Absolutely.
Many
in every
voices,
museum. Yep.
many different experiences. And I think the role of the museum is to bring them to bear and to make them audible and make them accessible. And in a way, through that, allow each individual, to activate that as your memory, as your cultural heritage. And I think that's the incredible power of such a space.